On May 13, 1941, a document bearing the letterhead Der Führer und Oberste Befehlshaber der Wehrmacht arrived at Wehrmacht headquarters in Berlin. Generalfeldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel signed it on behalf of Hitler. The decree's title was bureaucratic, almost soporific, the Barbarossa Jurisdiction Decree. 23 copies were prepared, and 19 would be dispatched the following day as top secret, with strict instructions that further distribution had to wait until June 1st. The language inside was precise and clinical. Military jurisdiction serves primarily to maintain troop discipline, nothing about justice, nothing about law. The decree acknowledged that the vast Eastern theater and the peculiar nature of the enemy required courts-martial to focus only on matters of military importance. What followed was revolutionary. Crimes by enemy civilians were withdrawn from military court jurisdiction indefinitely. Section by section, the decree dismantled accountability. Partisans were to be ruthlessly destroyed in combat or flight. All attacks by Soviet civilians against Wehrmacht personnel were to be suppressed with extreme measures, up to and including the annihilation of the attacker. Where individual perpetrators couldn't be identified, entire villages could be held collectively responsible. Then came the core provision, the one that would echo through 4 years of slaughter. Prosecution of offenses by Wehrmacht members against Soviet civilians wasn't required unless necessary for maintaining discipline. The Eastern Front had been declared a legal void 3 weeks before the Commissar order, before the first German boot ever crossed the Soviet border. 3 weeks after that legal void was established, on June 6, 1941, the mechanism of execution by Insignia arrived in writing. The document bore the classification Secret Command Matter to be transmitted by officer only. Wilhelm Keitel's authority stood behind what the Wehrmacht leadership already understood violated international law, the systematic murder of men identified by what they wore. The Commissar order opened with an ideological premise that would become a death sentence written in cloth and metal. In the struggle against Bolshevism, application of the principles of humanity is not to be expected. Political commissars, the directive continued, weren't soldiers. They were an outgrowth of the Jewish Bolshevik worldview, originators of barbaric Asiatic methods of warfare. Therefore, they were to be shot immediately as a matter of principle. The order provided screening instructions with the precision of an assembly manual. In all prisoner of war camps, certain categories were to be immediately held separately: political commissars, Comintern functionaries, leading Communist Party officials, and NKVD personnel. They were to be identified by special marks like badges, red stars, and red stripes. The red enamel star badge bearing a golden hammer and sickle was roughly 2 centimeters across, glossy when new, chipped at the edges after weeks in the field. The crimson piping on collar tabs, the sleeve patches worn by guards and NKVD troops. After segregation came the final phrase, after separation, to be dealt with. The bureaucratic passive voice that meant a bullet. The document traveled down through army groups, through corps commands, and through division intelligence officers. Distribution was restricted. Junior officers received oral briefings. The fewer paper trails, the better. What Keitel's system accomplished was elegant in its horror. The order mandated identification-based killing while simultaneously diffusing responsibility across institutional boundaries. Field commanders segregated prisoners. Intelligence officers verified identities. SS screening teams executed the final step. Each man could claim he merely followed his narrow function. The system murdered. No individual needed to feel the weight. Keitel would hang at Nuremberg. But in June 1941, his signature set the machinery in motion. The red star became a death warrant, and the bureaucracy made it routine. The paper trail ended where the killing began. In May 1941, Heydrich assembled the Einsatzgruppen commanders at Pretzsch and Düben in Saxony. These were top-secret meetings held in field assembly style, with men lined up in open squares near the marching grounds. Otto Ohlendorf, who would lead Einsatzgruppe D, later testified under oath that Streckenbach transmitted the orders of Heydrich and Himmler. When asked what those orders were, Ohlendorf answered with chilling precision, "The liquidation order, which I have already mentioned. The targets were Jews, gypsies, and Soviet functionaries, all of them, systematically, in the rear areas of the advancing armies. No written directive survives, and this was intentional. The extermination mandate moved orally, from Hitler to Himmler, to Heydrich to Streckenbach to the assembled commanders, each relay stripping away another layer of documentation. The system was designed to kill without leaving fingerprints. Yet coordination with the Wehrmacht was meticulous. The army would provide movement, supply, and logistical support. The Einsatzgruppen would receive their instructions from the chief of the security police. The generals knew. They nodded. They signed requisition orders for fuel and transport. The Wehrmacht didn't just allow the Holocaust in the East. It enabled it. The verbal directive system created plausible deniability at every node, but it required institutional complicity at every level. Wehrmacht intelligence officers shared lists of undesirables. They cordoned off execution sites. They handed over captured commissars and party officials to the SS screening teams. The fuel for the trucks that carried men to their deaths came from Wehrmacht depots. The guards who watched the perimeters wore Wehrmacht uniforms. The institutional complicity produced numbers that testified to its scale. Approximately 5,700,000 Soviet soldiers fell into German hands during Operation Barbarossa and the campaigns that followed. What happened to them wasn't the result of chaotic battlefield conditions or supply line failures. It was policy. Soviet prisoners were concentrated in open-air wire enclosures scattered across occupied territory and the Reich itself. At Stalag 3 and 26 in the Senne Heath near Schloss Holte-Stukenbrock, between 180,000 and 200,000 Soviet prisoners of war passed through the barbed wire perimeter beginning in July 1941. The wires stood roughly 3 meters high, sometimes topped with angled outriggers to support additional strands. Inside, a forbidden strip ran parallel to the fence, a Todesstreifen, a death zone. Guards received orders to shoot prisoners who entered this zone and to maintain sufficient distance from prisoners to ensure effective firing positions at any sign of disobedience. The rules were clear. The consequences were final. The winter of 1941 to 42 was the coldest European winter of the 20th century. An outbreak of unusually cold Arctic air at the end of January drove temperatures across north-central Germany to minus 20 degrees Celsius and below, with persistent snow cover blanketing the landscape. Private Sergei Mikhailov stood on the frozen parade ground in a summer tunic designed for August heat. His boots had rotted through 3 weeks earlier. Now his feet were wrapped in strips torn from a dead man's undershirt. The temperature had dropped to minus 20 degrees Celsius 2 days ago, and it hadn't risen since. Snow blew through the gaps in the barracks walls and accumulated in the corners where men huddled together for warmth. Ice formed on the inside of the wooden planks. When Sergei breathed, his exhalation crystallized immediately, a small cloud that dissipated into nothing. His fingers had turned the color of old wax. The sensation had left them days before. Now they were blackening at the tips. He knew what that meant. The men who went to the infirmary barracks with fingers like that didn't return. Roll call lasted 2 hours that morning. The guards counted and recounted, their breath steaming, their wool greatcoats buttoned to the chin. The prisoners stood motionless. Those who swayed were beaten. Those who fell were shot. The soup that evening would be cabbage water with traces of turnip. It would taste of rot and salt. The bread would be heavy and gray, sticky with a sour, moldy smell. 100 grams, if he was lucky, made partly of sawdust. By February, Sergei would be dead. The record would show exhaustion as the cause. The record would be accurate. By early February 1942, over 2 million of the 3,350,000 Soviet soldiers captured in 1941 were dead, a mortality rate approaching 60% in just 8 months. Wehrmacht logistics officers compiled these figures with the same administrative precision applied to ammunition expenditures. The reports noted prisoners arriving at rear area camps in carloads, dead when the trains stopped. In some camps, death rates reached 30 to 95% during winter 1941 to 42. This wasn't the chaos of battle. German food ledgers show the rations, one piece of bread made partly of sawdust, and a thin soup of cabbage leaves. The calories were calculated. The deaths were predictable. The Wehrmacht had transformed prisoner of war camps into instruments of mass death through policy decisions recorded in official documents, implemented through standard operating procedures, and tracked in monthly mortality reports filed up the chain of command. In the gulags, the transit camps that dotted the occupied territories, conditions were even worse. These were often nothing more than bare fields enclosed with barbed wire, where tens of thousands of newly captured Red Army soldiers stood in open pens without barracks, without latrines, and without wells. Prisoners slept on bare ground. When it rained, they slept in mud. When it froze, they slept on ground that had the texture of concrete. The smell of ammonia and decomposition hung over these camps like fog. Soviet political commissars wore their status on their sleeves, literally. A red cloth five-pointed star above each cuff with a hammer and sickle embroidered in gold thread at the center. German intelligence charts distributed before Barbarossa made sure every soldier knew what to look for. The June 6, 1941 directive transformed that piece of red fabric into a death warrant. Troops received explicit instructions to segregate commissars immediately on the battlefield by identifying the sleeve stars. No trial, no investigation of individual actions. The insignia alone sufficed. Polytruk Ivan Dmitrievich Sokolov had been a schoolteacher before the war. Literature, Pushkin and Gogol. He joined the party in 1938 because he believed in the words. Now, he stood at the edge of a shell crater with 11 other men, his hands bound behind his back with telephone wire that cut into his wrists. The July sun beat down on the back of his neck. He could smell fresh pine resin from the trees at the forest edge, mixed with the petrol exhaust from German trucks idling 50 meters away. A Feldwebel walked down the line, checking wrists and checking bindings. His boots crunched on the dry grass. He paused at each man, looked at the collar, and looked at the sleeves. Ivan's sleeve star was bright red against the khaki of his tunic. The gold thread of the hammer and sickle caught the sunlight. The Feldwebel pointed at him and said something in German to the officer standing by the trucks. The officer made a note on a clipboard. Ivan could hear the officer giving orders now. He couldn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. 4 soldiers were walking toward the line with rifles in their hands. One of them was young, and the young one's hands were shaking. The man next to Ivan began to pray. Ivan didn't pray. He thought instead of his wife, of the letter he'd written her 2 weeks ago that she would never receive. He thought of the classroom where he'd taught for 11 years. The first shot came from his left, then another, then another. Ivan kept his eyes open. He wanted to see the sky one more time. The procedure was systematic, and the insignia made it efficient. Thousands of Soviet political officers died in 1941 and 1942 because they wore a marker that made them targets. Germany had established the template, visible insignia equals summary execution without evidence of individual guilt. Between October and December 1941, 300,000 to 500,000 Soviet prisoners died each month in Wehrmacht camps, not in combat, not in executions behind barns, in camps that were often nothing more than bare fields enclosed with barbed wire, where men stood in open air as autumn turned to the coldest winter of the war. In October alone, almost 5,000 prisoners died every single day, a rate that exceeded the total deaths of British and American prisoners of war in German hands for the entire conflict. The Waffen SS would learn this lesson in reverse when Soviet forces reached German soil. When Red Army soldiers retook Kiev in November 1943, they found Babi Yar. The ravine held ash mixed with bone fragments. Private Nikolai Andreevich Zhukov had seen dead men before. He'd been in the army for 2 years. He'd fought at Kursk and at Kharkov. He thought he understood what death looked like. He was wrong. The ravine at Babi Yar was 30 meters deep. When Nikolai reached the edge and looked down, his legs gave out beneath him. The bottom of the ravine wasn't earth, it was ash. Ash mixed with bone fragments, ash mixed with teeth and scraps of cloth and the metal eyelets of shoes. Ash that moved in the November wind, lifting in small clouds and settling again. His throat closed, his stomach heaved. He turned away and vomited into the dead grass. The smell was black and sweetish, thick enough to taste. It clung to his uniform, to his hair, and to the inside of his nostrils. It would cling to him for weeks. Years later, he would sometimes wake from dreams of that smell and find himself unable to breathe. Political officers encouraged the soldiers to record what they saw. Nikolai borrowed a pencil and wrote in the margins of a requisition form. Children's shoes in piles, women's hair, earth that seemed alive with bones. The Red Army had discovered the operational template written in German orders, executed across hundreds of sites, and now laid bare in Ukrainian earth. What Soviet officers didn't yet fully grasp was how perfectly the Germans had marked themselves for the same fate. In the inner left arm of every SS man, approximately 20 centimeters above the elbow, a small black letter was tattooed into the skin, 7 millimeters tall, A, B, AB, or O. The blood group tattoo was designed for battlefield transfusions. It sat in the armpit crease, invisible when clothed, but unmistakable when arms were raised. Soviet NKVD filtration camps learned to look for it. SS Unterscharführer Kurt Brenner stood with his arms raised, stripped to the waist, in a line of 32 other men at Machikai camp in the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic. Bare bulbs hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows. Guards stood at the walls with submachine guns. A medical officer walked down the line, checking armpits. He carried a clipboard and a pencil. Intensity high. Kurt's heart was beating so hard he could feel it in his teeth. The tattoo was there. It had always been there. He'd received it in October 1941 at Dachau, along with 500 other recruits from the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf. The letter was A. The ink had faded slightly over the years, but it was still visible. He'd considered burning it off in April when the rumors started spreading about what happened to SS men who fell into Soviet hands. Helmut Fischer from 2nd Platoon had tried it with a cigarette. The wound had become infected. Fischer had died of sepsis in a ditch outside Vienna, delirious with fever. So Kurt had done nothing. The medical officer reached him, brown eyes and a tired face. He looked up at Kurt's raised arm, at the armpit, at the small black letter there. His pencil moved on the clipboard. He said something in Russian to the guard nearest the door. The guard nodded. Kurt felt a hand on his shoulder, pushing him toward a different exit than the one the other prisoners were using. The door led to a corridor that smelled of mildew and old sweat. At the end was another room where other men sat against the wall, their faces gray. He wouldn't leave that room for 3 days. When he did, it would be in the back of a truck bound for a camp where the survival rate was less than 1 in 4. The NKVD inspection report documented the procedure with clinical precision. German Major Sipman was ordered to undress. After his clothes were removed, interrogators noted that the letter A and the blood group were tattooed on his left armpit, which signified his membership of the SS. Both men were separated immediately. The symmetry was exact. The Commissar order had instructed Wehrmacht troops to identify political officers by their red star sleeve insignia, a visual marker requiring no documentation, no trial, only observation and execution. Now, Soviet guards walked through rows of stripped German prisoners, commanding hands up. Arms rose, armpits were inspected under bare bulbs. A small black letter meant transfer to special camps, interrogation, and often death. Some SS men had tried to erase the mark. Of 90 former Waffen SS interviewed after the war, 73 bore the tattoo. 5 had attempted removal before capture. They used hot irons and silver nitrate. They inflicted burns on themselves that left raw, puckered scars in precisely the location where the letter should have been. Soviet interrogators noted those scars too. The absence of the tattoo, when scarring marked the attempt to hide it, became evidence itself. The logic was identical to what Wehrmacht intelligence officers had applied to commissars. The attempt to hide the insignia proved consciousness of guilt. The screening process began before capture even ended. As Wehrmacht and Waffen SS units surrendered in the final months of the war, Soviet counterintelligence officers moved among the columns of prisoners with clipboards and checklists. The procedure mirrored precisely what the Wehrmacht had done to Soviet captives 4 years earlier: visual identification, followed by immediate segregation. By early May 1945, Soviet forces had processed 215,540 internees in present-day Poland alone, with 148,540 transferred to camps in the Soviet Union. 5,000 died during the screening process itself. On April 18, 1945, Lavrenti Beria issued NKVD Order No. 00315, establishing special camps designed to hold what the directive termed special contingent, SS members, Gestapo personnel, and concentration camp guards. No investigation was required before internment. The insignia itself constituted sufficient evidence. The order mandated that camps follow standard Gulag specifications. The provisional regulations defined the primary task as the total isolation of the contingent therein and the prevention of flights. No mail, no visitors, no notification to families, even upon death. Special Camp No. 7 at Sachsenhausen held 60,000 internees, and Zone 1 contained 30,000 of the special contingent. SS Sturmmann Heinrich Schäfer recognized the barracks. He'd been a guard here in 1943, before his transfer to the Eastern Front. He'd walked these same corridors. Now he slept on a wooden pallet in Block 14, surrounded by 200 other men who were slowly starving to death. The irony wasn't lost on him. It was just too heavy to lift. Winter arrived early that year. By November, the temperatures had dropped below freezing and stayed there. The rations were reduced further at the end of 1946. Heinrich's weight had dropped from 82 kilograms to 51. His ribs showed through his skin like the slats of a fence. The man in the pallet next to him had stopped breathing sometime during the night. Heinrich reported it to the block leader. The body was removed. Another man took the pallet that evening. This happened every day now, sometimes twice. By the time the camps closed in January 1950, 12,000 had died at Sachsenhausen alone. Across the system, 43,000 deaths were officially recorded, though the actual number of German prisoners was acknowledged to be 30,000 higher than initial counts. The administrative language never mentioned execution. It didn't need to. The tribunals convened throughout 1946, but the proceedings bore little resemblance to trials in any traditional sense. Military judges applied what Soviet law termed socialist legal conscience, a doctrine that weighed social danger and circumstance over individual evidence. For SS prisoners, the circumstance was membership itself. The tribunals operated under Article 58, 1A of the Penal Code, which prosecuted treason to the motherland as assistance to enemies like Germany. The statute made no distinction between a kitchen worker and a police auxiliary. The crime was the category. Identification methods determined outcomes. Medical officers examined arms for blood-type tattoos, or the telltale scar tissue where tattoos had been excised. Unit designations found in documents or extracted through interrogation established affiliation. Witness testimony from liberated prisoners confirmed presence at specific camps or actions. But the tribunals rarely required documentation of individual crimes. SS Unterscharführer Otto Weber sat on a wooden bench, watching 3 Soviet officers deliberate his fate. The proceedings had lasted 11 minutes. The prosecutor had read the charges: membership in the SS, service with the 2nd SS Panzer Division des Reich, and presence in the occupied Soviet Union. He'd presented a single piece of evidence, the medical report noting the presence of the blood group tattoo on Otto's left arm. Otto had tried to explain. He'd been a mechanic. He'd fixed trucks. He'd never fired a shot at anyone. The translator had conveyed his words in a flat monotone. The judges hadn't reacted. The presiding judge looked up and spoke a single sentence. The translator leaned toward Otto. 10 years corrective labor. Otto was 22 years old. He would be 32 when he emerged, if he emerged, from whatever labor camp they sent him to. The guards took his arms and lifted him from the bench. As they led him from the room, he caught a glimpse of the next prisoner being brought in. The judges were already shuffling papers, preparing for the next 11-minute trial. The numbers tell the story the trials merely confirmed. Of the approximately 5,700,000 Soviet prisoners of war captured by German forces, 3,300,000 died, a mortality rate of 60%. Intensity, medium. The SS blood group tattoo functioned exactly as the Commissar's red star insignia had functioned. It marked its bearer for separation and systematic destruction. SS Schütze Franz Keller stood in the basement of a bombed building near Vienna, holding a bayonet blade over a candle flame until the metal glowed orange. He pressed the tip against the skin of his inner arm. The pain was immediate and total, a white-hot spike that shot up through his shoulder and into his jaw. He pulled the blade away after less than a second, gasping. The burn mark was there now. It wasn't large enough. The tattoo was still visible beneath it. The Soviets were 3 kilometers away. The men without tattoos would survive. They would go to prisoner camps and would come home eventually. The men with tattoos would disappear. So he kept cutting. The knife blade had grown slippery with blood. He couldn't see clearly anymore. He pressed the blade deeper. The skin parted. The tattoo was still visible beneath the wound. Franz dropped the knife. He pressed his palm against the wound and began to cry. When the Soviets found him 3 hours later, the medic noted 2 things in his report: the failed attempt at tattoo removal and the letter B still visible at the edge of the scar. Franz was separated from the regular prisoners that same evening. The chain was complete. The Commissar order had established the foundational logic. Insignia alone could justify execution without determining individual guilt or requiring trial. The directive had stated explicitly that political commissars identified by their red star sleeve insignia are not to be recognized as soldiers. The protection due to prisoners of war under international law does not apply to them. The order acknowledged it violated international law. It proceeded anyway. This was the precedent the Wehrmacht and SS created, a system where visual markers replaced evidence of individual crimes, where separation protocols became death sentences, and where camp commanders bore no responsibility for what happened within the wire. When Soviet screening officers ordered German prisoners to strip to the waist in cold barracks, checking the inner left arm for the 7mm blood group tattoo, they were applying the Wehrmacht's own innovation. The SS runes on collar patches served the identical function the Commissar's red star had served: immediate identification without requiring documentation, systematic separation without trial, and outcomes determined by category rather than conduct. The Germans had written the operational manual. The Soviets read it carefully, then executed it with methodical precision against those who wore the skull insignia. SS Sturman Erich Vogel had stopped shivering 3 days ago. He understood what that meant. The body only shivers when it believes warmth is possible. When it stops believing, it stops trying. Fort Zinna had been a military prison before it became Speziallager number 8. The walls were thick stone, and they held the cold like a vessel holds water. There was no work here. The prisoners sat in their blocks and waited for food that wasn't enough, waited for warmth that never came, waited to become another body stacked by the fence. Erich thought about the Soviet prisoners he'd seen in 1944. They'd looked like the men around him now, the hollow cheeks, the visible ribs, the eyes that stared at nothing. He hadn't thought about them at the time. They were the enemy. Now, he was the enemy. The symmetry would have been elegant if it weren't so complete. The door to the block opened. A guard entered, stamping snow from his boots. He said something in Russian. The men who could still stand rose from their pallets. Roll call, again. Erich tried to rise. His legs wouldn't cooperate. He fell back onto the pallet. The guard looked at him and made a note on his clipboard. Later that day, 2 other prisoners would carry Eric to the infirmary block. He wouldn't return. The statistics formed a perfect mirror across the war's timeline. Wehrmacht camps killed 60% of 5,700,000 Soviet prisoners of war, primarily through deliberate starvation in 1941 to 1942. Soviet special camps produced death rates that, while lower than the German rate, were systematically elevated above baseline. The difference wasn't random, it was architectural. The Commissar order had established that Insignia justified execution without individual guilt determination. Soviet orders applied that principle with bureaucratic precision to those wearing the skull and runes, using the Wehrmacht's own identification methods, separation protocols, and administrative structures. In January 1950, the camp at Sachsenhausen was closing. Guards moved through the blocks at dawn, reading names from lists. Trucks waited at the gates. The unnamed prisoner sat on his pallet and watched. His name wasn't on the list. It had never been on any list. He'd entered the camp in August 1945 as a number, and he would leave it as a number. His left arm bore a scar where the tattoo had been. The medical officer who examined him in 1945 had noted it in his file. Evidence of attempted tattoo removal. Subject classified as SS pending investigation. The investigation had never come. The classification had never changed. He didn't know how many men had died in this camp. He'd stopped counting after the first winter. He knew only that the blocks were emptier now, and that the burial details had worked steadily throughout his time here. The trucks were leaving now. The gates closed behind them. The unnamed prisoner remained. Outside, the snow was falling. It covered the parade ground, the fence line, and the mass graves beyond the wire where 12,000 bodies lay in unmarked rows. It covered everything, white and cold and final. But the architecture remained, the architecture would always remain. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.